This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is June 27th, 2019, and this is episode 144. Politicos is a BC politics podcast. Tell us what you think of the show by filling out our survey at politicos.ca/survey. And help us build the show by throwing us a couple bucks a month at patreon.com/politicos.
I'm Scott Delonnebaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, it's quiet week, so we're just going to check in on the big provincial political news across the country and round it off with some usual littler BC Poly stories. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. And our other reminder that we'll keep throwing out there is that our 150th is coming up on August 8th. So let's talk about the view from the West. The Premier is coming back from Edmonton today. He was there meeting with Jason Kenney from Alberta, Scott Moe from Saskatchewan, Brian Pallister from Manitoba, and the premiers of the territories. I can't remember offhand. Apologies to our northern friends for what was ultimately a very boring affair. The premiers last year at the Western Premiers Conference meeting had quite the flare-up as BC and Alberta were in the middle of a spat over Trans Mountain. Alberta refused ultimately to sign any agreement, even on things they all agreed on, because Notley said, if we don't get a pipeline, I'm not signing your documents. And despite the fact Trans Mountain is still somewhat of a question mark between Alberta and BC, it's going ahead, but BC is adamant it won't. They seem to get along, like weirdly so.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to watch how, I guess, once the federal government has kind of signaled their intent that things kind of calm down a bit between BC and Alberta.
Well, and I think with the election coming up this fall, none of the remaining premiers, at least in the West, maybe Stephen McNeil out in Nova Scotia, but there aren't Liberal premiers left. Horgan could be seen as a sympathizer with Trudeau's agenda, but there's still enough that they can fight over that, especially Trans Mountain, that the real enemy, once again, is Ottawa and not one another. So they can get together and agree on vague principles like the priorities they listed in the agreement they signed, which says economic corridors across the country are good.
Not just economic corridors, but infrastructure corridors, which I guess in the last 6 months, everybody in the Canada's kind of come to a consensus that we're going to build an infrastructure corridor from coast to coast.
Once upon a time, we built a railway. Later, we built a highway. Now we can finally build some transmission lines.
And maybe a pipeline, depending on exactly what people read into this vague statement.
Exactly. Speaking of vague statements, all of the premiers, 3 of whom are deeply conservative and anti-carbon tax.
Like 2 deeply conservative ones and 1 like conservative premier.
They all agreed that action on climate change is important as long as we balance environmental stewardship and climate action with economic growth and competitiveness. And how that balance comes out, I guess, depends.
Was Justin Trudeau at this?
No.
Okay, no. They just looked at the language from the federal Liberals.
Yeah. They also agree to reduce barriers to interior trade, something we've talked about, not in a while, but repeatedly on this podcast, that it's amazing that a country like this, you have difficulty transferring your goods from one province to another, or even your accreditation. I think one of the things they highlighted is the difficulty of workers from going from one province to another in specialty fields.
Yeah, that's been an issue. But it's also simple stuff like trekking regulations change in every province. And there's like stuff that you can only do in the daytime in BC and have to do at nighttime in Alberta and vice versa.
The other thing provinces have no trouble agreeing about is that the federal government should stay out of provincial business like natural resources and healthcare. Now, of course, Alberta is very happy for Ottawa to be building a pipeline, which is a natural resource project. And all of the provinces are happy to get money for healthcare. But like any good premier, let them do it their own way. And the other thing that was a little bit interesting to come out of their agreement is they all do agree about working more with Indigenous communities, and particularly to make sure that those communities have opportunities in resource development. And I think this ties to some of the proposals, like the Indigenous groups looking to buy Trans Mountain or finding ways to make those better. And I think that's a win-win story for everyone. Maybe not that specific one, but those partnerships can be valuable and something conservatives can agree on, at least.
Yes.
But yeah, overall, it was almost a cringe-worthy level kind of conference. One of the stories coming out was that as Horgan was leaving to come back to Alberta, Kenney wanted to make the message clear to the media that, no, he's not storming off. And then Horgan says something like, I'll even walk slower if that makes it clear. Premier Dad strikes again. There wasn't anything big expected to happen at this. People were wondering if Kenney and Horgan would go at it, given how much they've been on different sides of these issues. But like I said, I don't think there was any political capital to be gained from either of them by exploding at this meeting. All eyes are on Ottawa for the fall. I think it's worth going across the country using this meeting as the opportunity to really look at what's been happening. Jason Kenney's been in office for a few months now, the new premier, and the question is, what kind of changes is he ramping through? The one thing my circles from Alberta tend to talk about a lot is education, and he's already talked about a bunch of big education reforms, rolling back things the NDP did and bringing in what he calls common sense reforms, which are things like standardized tests for grade 3s once again.
Seems early. I'm trying to remember when I wrote my first standardized. It's like grade 4 or 5 here in BC, or at least it was when I was in late elementary school. But like it was, just like a where you are testing.
I think I had them at 3, 6, 9, and 12, 12 being the diploma. But like BC, for example, is going towards, if it hasn't reached there already, getting rid of standardized testing entirely in favor of entrusting teachers to be able to analyze and evaluate how good the students are doing and whether they're prepared to go ahead or not. Alberta is taking a very different approach, apparently, which is let's run standardized tests. A lot of pedagogical and teaching experts are strongly against this kind of move because what it tends to show is students who are good at taking tests or who come from wealthier backgrounds or better socioeconomic status where they can do things like spend more time studying and not starve.
Like the grade 3 test didn't actually affect much. I mean, I really wasn't paying too much attention to education policy when I was doing like grade 4 or 5, whatever year it was standardized testing. But like, it really just seemed like kind of how was every school doing sort of testing. I could see it useful for just as like a government level, like it's hard to peer into every school and understand how every teacher kind of individually marks and assesses. So like at an aggregate level, there's value in it, even if you aren't like applying it directly to kids individually.
All it tells you is how many kids in each school are good at taking tests.
Yeah, but like there's a general problem that governments face in that it is hard to scrutinize the fine details of any implementation. And like this is probably as a decent enough kludge to at least get a general sense of where things are.
You know what makes standardized testing easier, though? Paying so that teachers are able to roll it out. And you know what Alberta is not going to do?
I'm guessing they're not paying much for
Not giving any additional funds to roll this out, which means cuts in other, not direct cuts, but rollbacks in other areas. So that's generated a bunch of controversy, and we'll see how things go. I know Alberta teachers have a few other pressures on them. I think we can start moving east across the country and see what else is going on. Saskatchewan's a very boring province.
I have driven through there, so yeah, I do know that. But
have you seen like anything happen in there in the last year, or at least few months?
Admittedly, the last I really paid attention to Saskatchewan was when they were having their like Saskatchewan bus fights or something.
When big budget cut.
Yeah, when they slashed their provincial coach line, basically.
Yeah, and that was a couple years ago.
Yeah, so I admittedly have not checked in on where Scott Moe is, and other than the fact that he's filing a lawsuit against the federal government about carbon taxes.
Yeah, I tried to poke around a little today. Didn't have a ton of chance, but I couldn't find much. Scott Moe's still very popular as a Conservative or Saskatchewan Party Premier is. Their election's coming up in October 2020 at the latest. Listeners, if you know what's happening in Saskatchewan, email us, podcast@politicos.ca. Manitoba's a little bit more interesting, though. They do have an election coming up, and they just called it for September 10th, which is very close to the federal election.
Yeah, it's pretty much right around when the federal writ is going to be issued. And like, campaign's going to be well underway by that point, regardless.
Which means political operatives in Manitoba are going to be very busy. And given there are a few Liberal seats there, the NDP are probably either hoping to hold their couple seats. I think they have at least one. I know they have at least one. And the Conservatives will obviously want to be taking those seats. So Manitoba's not going to be a battleground in the federal election, but there will be work for campaigners to do there. And now they're going to be working all summer as well.
Yeah, it's still nevertheless interesting in that, yeah, it does pull a lot of resources away and just attention to the general public. But Brian Pallister enjoyed a very comfortable lead in the polls. And, elections are always unpredictable, but decent lead, probably not a huge amount of attention. So unless there's some big screw up on the part of the PCs, probably fairly safe to coast on it. And yeah, I guess this just means he won't be spending the summer in Costa Rica.
I mean, he still might. Yeah, the last poll I could pull up had the PCs at 42%, and the opposition parties very divided. Wab Kinew and the NDP are sitting at 25%, and Kinew has been under a lot of controversy even since his leadership campaign because he has some allegations of assault in his past that are kind of simmering under the surface. And the NDP there are trying to go early on he's changed, he's reformed, and let's move past that and look to the future. But that's still only attracting the support of 25% of Manitobans. The Liberals, meanwhile, are up to 16%, and the Green Party of Manitoba is at 14%. So this might be another possible breakthrough for the Greens, which Manitoba is not where I'd expect.
Seat, I guess?
Yeah, which would be a breakthrough for the Greens in Manitoba, I think. Realistically, a divided opposition like that probably means PCs just run over the entire province and paint it blue. So, not too interesting, other than that there is an election. Well, where things are happening is Ontario, the center of the Canadian universe, of course. How's Doug Ford's first year gone?
It's been rocky, to say the least. He came in, not popular, but, definitely won a comfortable majority. I think Ontario felt like it was time for a change. And incidentally, I think those feelings now persist with this new government too, less than a year in, because they are not popular at all.
Yeah, a great recap of the Doug Ford premiership is probably the Wag the Doug podcast with Alison Smith of Queen's Park Today, the sister publication.
We could spend hours just going through the last year of the Ford shenanigans. But there's been a fair bit of controversy, from slashes to autism support funding, which has generated quite a backlash, to...
He upset libraries.
He upset libraries. At one point, he just...
Toronto maliciously.
Randomly changed Toronto City Council setup, weighed in on a zoning issue in one part of Toronto, which... I kind of like the fact that provinces might get a little more involved in that policy area, but it was just such a random, these 4 blocks Doug Ford suddenly thinks need to be a little different. And then, did a big cabinet shuffle last week. But the problem wasn't that the cabinet wasn't performing well. The problem is the cabinet was trying to execute bad orders from up top, and changing the spokespeople for the bad decisions probably isn't going to help Doug Ford at all.
Well, and there was a lot of talk about how big of a shuffle it was, because it wasn't just there were 1 or 2 underperformers that he needed to move out after a year. It was more like he blew up his government and started over by moving everyone to random, he shuffled a deck of cards and said, that's where you go now. And I don't know what the strategy is there, other than he's mad at everyone for not being effective in an ineffective situation.
I don't think Doug Ford is a particularly strategic thinker when it comes to government. It seems to be more government by reaction.
So where, in some ways, I was very disappointed by Ontarians for voting for Ford, what I am encouraged by is the fact that when asked if they like or dislike how he's doing, his approval numbers, the difference between those is a negative 54.5% dislikes over likes. And by comparison, Kathleen Wynne a year ago, just before she lost her election, was at a minus 35.
Yeah, that's bad. And I think the Liberals in Ontario had been around pretty much as long as the BC Liberals, and people were much more tired of them in Ontario than here. So I think it's hard to understate just how much Ontario felt they needed to change. And, you could argue whether or not that they should have gone with the NDP rather than the Conservatives, but Doug Ford was pretty much guaranteed to win from the moment he won the leadership. He massively spoiled the hand he was dealt on this.
Well, and the vitriol against the Liberals in Ontario seems to have been almost entirely a Kathleen Wynne issue. Because, with some of the polls showing now, one showed the Liberals back into first place under an interim leader, and another showing them in a three-way race.
Kathleen Wynne was a part of it, but people were pretty tired of the Liberals when Dalton McGuinty was still running things. The Liberals losing an election was a long time coming, and I think it's only because Ford's managed to mangle things so badly that the Liberals are kind of rebounded so quickly. And one other thing is that he just had his, I think, chief of staff resign after there was some controversy about a relative getting appointed to a swanky position. So, yeah, it's been a pretty rough ride. Rough enough that, in addition to shoveling his cabinet, Doug Ford decided to prorogue over the entire summer and basically go into running silent mode throughout the federal election. He announced that before the cabinet shovel, so he hasn't done a great job at maintaining that so far, but there's definitely, I think, a pretty commonly accepted view that the more noise Doug Ford makes, the bigger Andrew Scheer's problems are.
Which is amusing because 6-9 months ago, they were happy to be on every stage they could, talking up the conservative resistance that's going to shake up Ottawa. And now I think Jason Kenney is the conservative friend that Andrew Scheer wants. And I think Kenney is smarter and smart enough not to run like the bull in the china shop over everything.
Yeah, he's a veteran of the Harper years, and the strategy in that time was, tamp down on the elements that make a large part of Canadians uncomfortable, namely the social conservatism. And so far, Kenney seems to more or less have followed in that vein, whereas Doug Ford has a much more bull in the china shop approach. And the Ford coalition, I think, is more diverse than a lot of people give it credit for, but nevertheless, it's how Ford is governed has presented enough problems where associated with him is now a liability. And of course, this has made Justin Trudeau very happy because he basically can now run against Doug Ford and paint Andrew Scheer with the same brush.
Right. Well, from Ontario, where we have some passing knowledge, to the remainder of the provinces where we have little to none, let's go into Quebec, where it's always good for English Canada to talk about the distinct politics of Quebec. And I think I'm being sarcastic, the biggest story out of Quebec these days has been the passage of Bill 21 into law. This is the laïcité secularism bill that declares Quebec's value of separation in church and state, which is something I support, but then it goes into this public servants shall not wear religious symbols, which is ill-defined, and if you're accessing public services, you need to remove any headgear that may obstruct your view of your face. And just for a good measure, the government, at the last minute when it was invoking this or passing this bill, added a couple amendments, one of which was to essentially create not a police force to investigate this, but a department of people to make sure these rules are enforced, which is great.
It's a rather Quebec thing to do. There's the
language police.
Yeah, I was trying to think of the official name for them, but I can't recall the official name. But yeah, the create a public civil service department to enforce this. It's not unheard of.
And of course, for good measure, the provincial government in Quebec also invoked the notwithstanding clause in this bill so that it won't be subject to specific charter challenges, but that hasn't stopped a couple of groups from already launching more creative constitutional challenges.
As in trying to cite the sections of the Constitution that aren't covered by the notwithstanding clause?
So the notwithstanding clause covers Section 2 and 7th through 15, I believe. So you can't change voting rights on there, but near the end, I think it's section 28 or 27, one of them declares the equality of men and women. So some people are trying to use that to say this law undermines that equality because more women wear religious symbols than men, like Muslim ones.
It really breaks down by which religious group
Exactly.
I don't know, that it seems to be a little questionable just on the grounds that, like, if the province's demographic makeup was a little different, it would be the other way around. And, like,
the other legal challenge is that this is effectively a criminal law, and only the federal government has the ability to invoke criminal law, not
what's
Quebec.
the punishments? Just
Loss of job?
It's not really a criminal thing, though. Just like that, it's like employment and administrative law sort of stuff.
I'll give credit to creativity for the legal team, because finding ways around the notwithstanding clause is difficult. But, I'm skeptical of how far these will go. I appreciate that they're trying. I think that's Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the National Canadian Coalition of Muslims, something like that. I forget the exact name. Nevertheless, the bill is fairly popular in Quebec. Ultimately, the Liberals and Quebec Solidaire voted against it. I think the Liberals have always been on the edge of this one. The previous Liberal government tried to bring in something slightly weaker that then the Parti Québécois didn't go far enough. And it's been in the news in Quebec for 6 years now, 7 years, as they try to get this, and even longer if you count the Bouchard-Taylor kind of debates over inclusivity in Quebec. And it's just such a different debate in that province that politically it's popular, and I don't think François Legault is going to suffer any consequence politically for doing this.
No, I don't think he will either.
I mean, maybe in Montreal, but I don't think that was his base.
No, it wasn't. And, it's not popular in the rest of Canada, but the rest of Canada isn't electing the Quebec government, so it doesn't really hurt him.
I think there actually is some polling to suggest there's sympathies for similar moves in the rest of Canada on like a surface level, but there's no political will there. And I think the established consensus is not to go down this kind of route. The question I'm wondering about is, does this become part of the debate in the federal election in Quebec? In 2015, the niqab ban at the citizenship ceremonies was something that really hurt the NDP in Quebec, even though the Liberal position was identical. It was just, I think the bloc of voters the NDP was trying to access in Quebec included a lot of Bloc Québécois supporters who were very pro these kind of policies. And Jagmeet Singh has a very clear position against Bill 21 as a person who wears a turban himself. I just don't want it to be another ugly identity type issue like this election, but that seems inevitable.
Yep.
So that's Quebec. Atlantic Canada is something I don't think either of us have much to say on. The only story I've followed recently out of there is Newfoundland had its recent very close election, like apparently every election has been going this year, except Alberta. There was one NDP MHA who won by 5 votes, and so that went to a judicial recount. Drew Brown at Newfoundland on Twitter live tweeted the judicial recount for this one constituency, and it was a painful insight into the ugliest part of our democracy in some ways, which is how many people are unable to effectively vote. What happened is they go through the recount and count up all the very clear ballots and get an initial number, and then they've set aside all of the ones the judge needs to say yes or no to, and who it clearly voted for. And Drew Brown tweets out most of the rulings as they come, which include things like someone checked one but put a dash through another name, and that might have been counted. Someone else wrote good luck beside one candidate but then checked off another, like they knew that guy and were just hoping he'd do well but didn't actually want to vote for him.
It's I don't know, maybe it's a small friend. It's Labrador. It's a Labrador riding, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, friendly small town, I guess.
One of the other votes was someone just wrote yes, B apostrophe, yesba.
Yes, bye.
Which is the most Newfoundland way to vote, I guess.
It is aggressively Newfoundlander.
Other people tore it near where the person was, and they had to decide whether that counted. And what's impressive is how many of these did count according to the judge. And after each of these is considered, lawyers for both sides argue it. like, yes, that should count because, or no, it shouldn't because it's unclear. In the end, after all of these votes were argued and counted, the New Democrats' lead was reduced from 5 to 2 votes, but he managed to hold on. And so that means the minority situation in Newfoundland and Labrador maintains, which 2 votes is a very tight situation. The other Newfoundland and Labrador story that I saw pop up is the federal government is studying a fixed link between Newfoundland and Labrador.
Really? That's a wide strait.
And there's not many people on Labrador.
No, there really isn't.
I don't know how possible, likely
I
it
doubt
is.
that can be cost effective. Like, how deep is it there?
I mean, they built the bridge to PEI.
Yes, and that was a fairly shallow strait.
So that's Newfoundland and Labrador. Congrats to the MHA who managed to hold on to that seat. I mentioned PEI. The only update I have on PEI is the by-election for the candidate who died in the middle of the election. That by-election will be held on July 19th, and that will decide, I think, whether the Greens have a slightly larger official opposition or not. And it seems likely they might win that one. The rest of the Maritimes, I could not find too much on. I guess the minority government in New Brunswick is holding, and the narrow Liberal majority, it's like just on the edge in Nova Scotia, is also holding together. But I guess the big story for the Maritimes will be whether the federal Liberals hold on to their 100% of all the seats there in the fall.
Probably not.
Yeah, that's a very tough situation to hold. You can only go down.
Yeah, and not only that, there's some ridings that were, solidly NDP or Conservative for a long time, and probably at least 1 or 2 of them are going to regress to the mean.
And the only thing I could see that's happening in the territories, and this again is a very brief search through, is the Northwest Territories are having an election on October 1st.
That's right in the middle of the election.
Northwest Territories also operates without parties on a consensus basis, so it'll be a much different kind of election than the federal one, but I don't know enough about Northwest Territory politics to say anything more than that. So we clearly missed lots that's happening. If you want to help fill us in, suggest some guests, tell us the stories we should be highlighting, we're going to be looking for lots of content this summer.
Yes.
Just send us an email.
What is the most batshit thing Doug Ford has done? Let us know that. I'm sure that'll make some good podcast content. Moving on to quick takes. The BC Auditor General has concluded that a program started under the previous government to sell surplus land and assets has, quote, room for improvement, and that the government didn't necessarily get its full value when it unloaded over $1 billion, I believe, worth of various properties that it held.
Yeah, there's a really detailed analysis in the Vancouver Sun by Laurie Colbert, who builds off the AG's report and looks at essentially all the public sales since 2013 of assets. Most of these were under the BC Liberals. A few concluded more recently, which seemed like deals that were in progress that the NDP just didn't kill, because it's usually a bad idea to kill a sale halfway through. And yeah, the overwhelming conclusion is just everything seemed too rushed and we got screwed in a lot of cases. The Sun is article is really detailed and breaks down like a number of sales where things were flipped right after they were bought for much more, or one case was flipped the same day that it was bought off the BC government.
It's a little sketchy there.
Yeah.
There's definitely been issues with real estate where we're acting as both the buyer and seller and having to, pocket in the commissions on both ends, which has caused problems.
There's a case in there where the buyer then subdivided it and resold it for significantly higher than they bought it off the government. I think there's also an analysis that shows a lot of the buyers had given to the BC Liberals at some point. And that one I'm actually less surprised by, because I think everyone was giving to the BC Liberals. That's what you give to the government.
Yeah, it's pretty common for large interests to give money to both parties. I'm looking at it here. So one of the Vancouver Sun stories lists 5 major development corporations. Yeah, they were given to both parties. So it's one of those things where it's optically it's bad, but it's also kind of, you just give to both parties as part of doing business, which probably shouldn't be done. It doesn't happen anymore, but it's not necessarily a sign that something was not on the up and up. I think the bigger problem, though, was that a certain amount of this was to try and get some revenue on the books to make the budget numbers look good, and it's not great when you're rating the assets to do that.
Yeah, and a lot of these properties were owned by school districts or healthcare regions. Now, like the Vancouver School Board, for example, was under immense pressure in 2017, I believe it was, to sell off assets. And when they didn't, to balance the budget, the minister fired the school board there because they wouldn't balance the budget. And there was a number of other things at the same time, including
there were
the harassment.
allegations of harassment and stuff, too.
It was the balanced budget, though, that was the ultimate reason for firing. And, the Vancouver School Board held on to Kingsgate Mall, for example. And every year that seems like a better decision because it's just money in the bank for them. So it's tough. Like, there are some assets that the government has no more use for, and there shouldn't be a ban on them selling things off.
Yeah, you want to be able to do definitely. I know there's been cases where the federal government has found, like, just owning the office building is costing them, like, more than it made sense to, like, lease an equivalent amount of office space elsewhere. And, like, there's stuff like that where it can make fiscal sense to sell assets. But it looks like this was rushed.
Which, it doesn't feel like such a story now that the BC Liberals are out of office for a couple of years. It's definitely not good for them. And I'm sure it's something the BC NDP will be more than happy to bring up when we go to the next election. But where the province was able to make some, if not enough money off selling off assets, where it turns out BC is not making much money, is off cannabis sales. StatsCan has the latest data out for April, and in that month alone across the country, there was $74.6 million in legal cannabis sales, but British Columbia pulled in just $2.5 million of that. We were actually the second lowest province in cannabis sales, just ahead of PEI. We spent half of what Nova Scotians spent at almost $5 million. And now that's not to say British Columbians aren't smoking pot. It's just I think they're still getting it from Betty and Souk, or callback, or any of the medicinal cannabis dealers that are still dispensing in this province.
It's not really a surprise. They've been pretty slow to roll out in-person brick-and-mortar cannabis shops. And even some of the online stuff wasn't great. Although we do have, Intimate Lube now, so that's a thing you can get. And to help pad out these numbers if you're so inclined.
Yeah, it looked like Ontario's numbers jumped a bunch after their store started rolling out. But yeah, British Columbia is still fairly slow on it. A number of municipalities are still dragging their heels on licensing. I think Vancouver's only got a couple stores up and running, but most of those are still just the private ones. Burnaby, for example, is waiting for the public stores to open in that city, but there's no word on when that might or will happen. It kind of leaves the question going, where's the green? The other bit of cannabis news that came out, and this was a couple weeks ago, is the federal government announced the edibles regulations that will come out in the fall. A lot of cannabis activists have been waiting for this, and they were thoroughly disappointed. The regulations will come into effect in mid-October, which I guess means they can start producing them, so expect your gummies for Christmas. It'll be a green Christmas. The big thing a lot of people are upset about is there's going to be a limit of 10 milligrams of THC per product that you can buy. Turns out most Canadians don't know what that means, but people who use a lot of cannabis think that that is the equivalent of a little airline bottle of booze being the max size you're allowed to buy. On the other hand, the BC Centre for Substance Use advocated a limit of 2.5 milligrams per product because I think the physiology of THC is you can become accustomed to it very easily. So there are some people who can take 100 milligrams and barely have a hit. And then there's others who that first 10 milligram gummy will probably put you out for the night. So I don't know how reasonable it was, but it's a very tough situation for the federal government. And maybe they found a balance, or maybe this wasn't enough. One of the complaints for people who wanted it to be much higher was people who have medicinal uses or use it more medicinally need those higher doses. I think they'll still be able to get prescriptions for higher, and I think that makes the compromise work out. But it's a clunky rollout. That's been the entire story of cannabis in this country. Clunky, messy, sometimes unconstitutional rollout.
One thing that has been rolling so smoothly is electric vehicles, to the point where the government is running out of money on their electric vehicle rebate because the uptake has been so successful that they're now actually scaling back how much they're going to rebate and add an additional $26.5 million in funding for the program. So this was the previous $2,000 to $6,000 rebate, and now it's being lowered to a maximum of $3,000 for EVs and $1,500 for hybrid electric plug-ins.
And the cap for vehicles that qualify has been dropped from 77,000 to 55,000. So fewer electric vehicles will now be eligible for these rebates. It's good that people are buying electric vehicles on the one hand. You almost would want to see, if the government was committed to this program, them to find a lot more money, but I guess budgeting is a bit tough, especially when you're floating around the balance and you don't want to impact that AAA credit rating you just got reconfirmed with. And in terms of long-term transition, putting everyone in electric vehicles is only a part of Clean BC.
Yeah, but it's still a necessary part. Like, I think it's easy for people in our circles to just talk about, just build everything with transit and walkability. But, people on the edge of cities and, in rural areas, it's just not practical to go completely transit for those people. So, yeah, it's better that they be driving an EV than a gasoline car.
Yeah. And hopefully there's still money for expanding the charging network.
Yeah, and not only that, as you're building out your other stuff, you might as well be trying to get as many people who aren't doing the full changeover yet into EVs rather than, shaming them until they ride transit and the transit's built out for them.
Well, in good news for civil libertarians, the BC Civil Liberties Association and John Howard Society are celebrating a big win at the Court of Appeal. The two groups had filed and won at the Supreme Court an injunction against solitary confinement, or what the government calls administrative segregation, in provincial correctional facilities, and that was appealed. The federal government then also lost a case against the Canadian Civil Liberties Association in Ontario in federal correctional facilities, and because of both of those, brought forward a bill to bring in some limits. Because before this, essentially prisoners could just be put in administrative segregation indefinitely, meaning no real connection to other humans, no outside time, things that really destroy you as a human. And that is bad. And the court, presented with an overwhelming amount of evidence in the BCCLA case, agreed. And then at the Court of Appeal, they unanimously upheld that lower decision, saying a legislative provision that authorizes the prolonged and indefinite use of administrative segregation in circumstances that constitute the solitary confinement of an inmate within the meaning of the Mandela rules deprives an inmate life, liberty, and security of the person in a way that is grossly disproportionate to the objectives of the law, and goes on to highlight the draconian impact of this, really leans into the previous judge's factual findings. The Court of Appeal did modify a few of the lower court's remedies, adjusting it slightly. I don't know the subtleties and nuances, but it looks like the Court of Appeal actually made it a stronger decision, which is really good to see. Like I said, the federal government's already changed some of the laws, but the BCCLA and others were still critical of those, of not going anywhere near far enough. They give inmates some rights back, but I think the courts here have been fairly clear that solitary confinement is just an inhumane way to treat people. And if that's what our correctional system's been falling back on, we need to start rethinking this from the ground up. And it's going to cost money, but to manage this properly is going to just take doing things to fix it. I think one of the things the BCCLA was also really good at highlighting with the evidence they brought in is how this practice is so disproportionate on people of color, Indigenous people, the people who the justice system cracks down on far too disproportionately. And so that's what some of this language, and I think the Court of Appeal is really getting at. And so that's very promising, I think. And just a good reason to keep supporting the organization of which I'm on the board of. Not that I'm biased. But it'll be interesting to see where Parliament goes now that they've passed a slight modification but are still facing pretty stark rulings from the courts. It would be something for the federal government to appeal this once again, but we'll kind of see, because we're in that weird situation where the law being argued about has been changed slightly, whether it's enough.
Well, it'll probably be our final discussion of the Admiral Mark Norman saga. He announced this week that he was retiring. This was pretty likely, so there isn't much surprising about this because it is, well, hard to go back to work after your boss pretty much accused you of a crime.
Well, let's ask Gary Lenz if he ever manages to get back to work, but that's a different story.
That's a different story.
Yeah, I think the biggest question was going to be whether Vice Admiral Norman reached any kind of early settlement deal with the Department of National Defense, and it seems like he just voluntarily retired without a deal. Probably still for the best from his point of view. I mean, there's only so much you can keep fighting, and you're clearly not going to work for an organization, even the government, after you get thrown under the bus. So, once again, we'll probably still never know what fully happened there, but hopefully he enjoys his retirement. And finally, the BC government has launched a consultation on whether to change to daylight savings time year-round.
Yes, please kill daylight savings time or just adopt it full-time, whatever. Just don't make us change our clocks twice a year.
engage.gov.bc.ca/daylight savings time. Link will be in the show notes. We've talked about it before. It's a good thing to change or to stop changing clocks. Saves lives. It'll be more efficient. And it's very likely that the whole West Coast might be moving this way, as Oregon, Washington, and California are all at different stages of considering bills and propositions to move this way.
Yeah, in fact, one of the questions they asked is, should we go it alone if the other ones don't, or should we wait for everyone else to do it? And, yeah, good. We have to go it alone, so be it. I don't do a lot of traveling immediately south, so...
I was so conflicted on those questions, because on the one hand, I'm like, we should go it alone. But also, if they change, we should change because I want us to change.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah.
think either way, we're agreed on the policy direction. Whatever the rationale is can be filled in after. So yeah, go fill that out, and hopefully the information's overwhelmingly positive towards the change and the government follows through. And that has been Politos. Find links to everything we talked about at politos.ca. If you're a first-time listener, make sure to subscribe and listen to everything. Support the show and get access to exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politos. If you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Thurston Plotnick. Thanks for listening.